Thank you very much, Philip, for that backwards-looking introduction. And just to say, I do feel like my past life is passing in front of me when I come here, people from various stages here. And in fact, the first thing I was asked to do was to reminisce a little. In fact, I was quite a strange choice for the launch director of the Low Carbon Vehicle Partnership, because I'm no petrol head. I don't even own a car now. And when I was launch director, I remember being taken to the motor show when the UK had a motor show by SMMT, Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders. And they were so disappointed that I headed straight to the Peugeot stand because they were exhibiting Peugeot-branded bicycles there, as well as car. But just to say, it is incredibly satisfying to see a body that you put quite a lot of effort into creating about 20 years ago. And it's not just that it's survived, and that is an achievement in itself, but it's thriving as well. And I think that makes me quite proud. But obviously, things have moved on. There's a new name. Also a new business model. It started out as a government-funded body. There's a new level of ambition because low emissions has become zero emissions. And there's an enhanced focus because it's not just vehicles and fuels in the way that it was set up. It's more widely about mobility. Now, one other lesson I think I would recall from the early days was the importance of not picking winners too quickly. Just over 20 years ago, the world was going through a bit of hydrogen fever, and that fever spread to number 10 Downing Street as well. And I do remember that every few weeks we got a call from number 10 saying, how's the hydrogen vehicle partnership going? And we would have to correct them and say it's the low carbon vehicle partnership, please. We were hedging our bets on the technologies. So I just wanted to recall a little the conclusions of IPCC in the last cycle, which concluded just over a year ago. There has been a transportation chapter in every Working Group 3 report, that's the working group that looks on mitigation, for the last 3 cycles of IPCC, going right back to 2007. And I was co-chair of Working Group 3 in the 6th cycle of IPCC, the last one, so I can certainly report on what the high-level conclusions were from that. Now, starting most broadly, the overall conclusion that globally emissions of greenhouse gases fall by 43% by 2030 in scenarios that limit warming to 1.5 degrees, and 21% in scenarios that limit warming to 2 degrees. And I will confess these numbers are now probably well past their sell-by date, given the lack of action that's taken place since the reports first came out. But the key message is very clear. We need very substantial reductions in emissions if the long-term temperature goal in the Paris Agreement is going to be reached. And reaching these kinds of reductions, it needs what we call rapid and far-reaching transitions in energy systems, land, industrial systems, urban systems, buildings, and in transport and associated infrastructure. And these system changes would be unprecedented in terms of scale. But interestingly, if you look back, not necessarily unprecedented in terms of the speed of the transition. We can move quickly. Now, very clearly, looking at energy systems, net zero CO2 energy systems requires a substantial reduction in overall fossil fuel use, the transitioning away from fossil fuels mentioned in the UAE consensus. It means electricity systems that emit no net CO2, and it implies widespread electrification of the energy system, including end uses. It can involve the use of other energy characters, like sustainable biofuels or low-emissions hydrogen, in specific end uses that are less amenable to electrification. It, of course, means conservation and efficiency, and importantly, it also involves better integration across the energy system and between the energy system and other systems such as transport. So transportation, and specifically electrification, has, along with renewable energy, been at least one of the partial success stories that we have seen in terms of decarbonisation. And we identified gigatons worth of avoided emissions globally that are associated with actions that have been taken. Now, another point I want to make about our last report, that's all about technology. And we were actually determined, almost for the first time, to bring people into the last mitigation report of IPCC. So we had a new chapter, a completely new one, on demand, services, and social aspects of mitigation. And what the authors did was to start with the services that people need and aspire to, look at the most efficient way of delivering the energy that would be needed to supply these services, and then look at the emissions associated with that energy. And the three services that were looked at were nutrition, shelter, and mobility. I have to say the hottest one was nutrition, but we don't want to go in there. Let me mention the mobility one. It was looked at through the lens of avoid, shift, and improve, and it attributed the potential for mitigation to lifestyle, behaviour, and consumer choices, things like cycling, walking, active transport, to infrastructure, including public transport, shared mobility, compact cities, and ways of spatial planning, and thirdly, to technology adoption, which would include electric vehicles, shift to more efficient vehicles. And comparing to current levels, they estimated the reduction potential associated with these was 5% for the pure behavioural choices, 30% for the infrastructure provision, and 50% for technology adoption. There's an interaction between them, so you can't add them up. It turns out the overall potential is about a 70% reduction by 2050 if that way of proceeding is followed. And just to say, that's absolutely consistent with an overall emissions pathway that results in a global warming of 1.5 degrees. So it's a clear demonstration that it is possible to move in that kind of way. And I think the key point is that you can't take these things separately. Behavioural choices, infrastructure, and technology interact, and you can't get one without the other. And electric vehicles is the classic example. We need consumers to be able to feel that they can make the choices. We need infrastructure in terms of charging technology, and we need manufacturers to provide vehicles that people have confidence in and have the right kind of range. So it's not one thing, it's all three things interacting together. Now, looking forward to the next cycle of IPCC, it's about a year ago since the cycle started. It'll probably run till about 2029, and we still have to scope the three traditional working group reports of IPCC. But we do have an outline of a special report on climate change in cities, which will appear in 2027. And the first lead author meeting for that will take place in March next year. And we're just in the process at the moment of selecting the authors for that. And obviously, transportation is a very significant part of that report. So governments have agreed what the scope will be, and the kind of bullet points that they have agreed to include things like urban emission trends, including consumption-based emissions, the role of cities in net zero targets, the interaction between cities and city regions and the national level. On the impacts and adaptation side, the city-specific risks, including risks to transportation systems and possible adaptation measures. Specific mitigation options for urban mobility and transport, and then all the kind of enabling factors like spatial planning, planning under uncertainty, governance, and finance. So these will be covered in that cities report. Now, I can't talk about what happens in the working groups because they have yet to be scoped. We don't even know whether there will be a transportation chapter. But I think some of the themes that are going to come up. Fiona mentioned just transition, and the other part of my history was, of course, that I chaired the Scottish Just Transition Commission. And when we were looking at the transport issues, the question of fairness and justice around transport for people living in rural areas, people on lower incomes, was absolutely critical. Now, I remember having a transport-themed meeting in Dundee, which is my hometown, and we spent an afternoon with the transport professionals being shown more battery charging points than I would ever want to see. We then, in the evening, had a town hall people with basically ordinary people, and all we got was an earful about bus timetables and whether the buses were safe for women in the evenings. So it is really, really important to think about the wider people, I think, aspects of the transition. I think the other aspect we need to think about in the future, the kind of trends that we have in the moment, there are big issues associated with supply chains, the critical materials such as lithium for batteries, and there's big issues of availability and access to resources, which are now on the agenda. And in relation to that as well, let me say it's not just transitioning out, just transition out, it's just transition in. Because if we look at these supply chains, we can see lots of issues about human rights, labour practices, respect for indigenous cultures that are going to need to be considered and will come along to the agenda. So I am very certain that these topics will be covered in the 7th cycle. Now, just to finish off, and just a couple of general points. Very obviously, national governments have a central role to play in climate action. They set the mood music, they provide the overall frameworks, they establish the ground rules and the incentive structures, but they can't do it all by themselves. It needs interaction with local government, it needs interaction with businesses, the finance sector and civil society. And this is particularly true in the transport sector. And we do need spaces where representatives of these different sectors can engage and work together to achieve ambitious outcomes. And I have to say that was the ambition when the Low Carbon Vehicle Partnership, as it was then called, was set up. And it is indeed a great pleasure to see Zemo fulfilling that role and continuing with it. And I have to say it's been great to see you thriving, and I hope the next 20 years or so will be just as successful.